Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Oh, I got it right that time. Anyways, I also wanted to say thanks to Andrew, by the way, for loaning me the camera for this review. You know who you are. In fact, you're Andrew. So yes, I do not own this camera. It's kind of weird to say, because I own a lot of cameras. But yes, this has been generously loaned out to me. So what is it? What is this? Well, it's the Sony DCS R1. Not the RX1, not the RX1R, not the RX1R whatever version we're on. This is the daddy, as they say. So let's get into it. What is the Sony R1? Well, the R1 is a bridge camera. It was released in September of 2005, and it featured a 10.3 megapixel CMOS sensor of the APS-C size. And it's indicated right here on the camera, 10.3 megapixels, CMOS, wow. And the sensor is obviously made by Sony. It had an ISO range of 160 to 3200, and the shutter is a leaf shutter with speeds from 3 minutes to 1/2000th of a second, depending on what mode that you're shooting in. And since this is a leafy leaf shutter of leafiness, the flash sync is supported at any shutter speed. The lens on this camera is the equivalent of 24mm to 120mm, with a maximum aperture of f2.8 to 4.8 on the long end. The closest focusing distance of this lens is 35 centimeters, and it is a Carl Zeiss T-Star lens. Ooh. When it comes to autofocus, the camera uses contrast detect from 2005. Keep that in mind. And when it comes to shooting speed, it can shoot at 3 frames per second in JPEG only. There's no continuous shooting for RAW. The R1 comes with a built-in flash over here. And, well, how do I get it up? I'm just gonna do that. And for storage, you get actually dual card slots. You get compact flash and memory stick. And it's implemented in a terrible way, which we'll get into a little bit later. The camera features an electronic viewfinder, which at the time was pretty nifty, and it comes in at 235K dots. Crispy. The main LCD is on the top of the camera, right here, and it comes in at an even crispier 134K dots. And the battery that this camera uses is the venerable NP-FM50, which, by the way, you can still buy fresh new third-party copies of all the way in 2025. Let's see if I can get this thing to... Ooh, there we go. Now, the R1 is clearly a light, compact camera, coming in at 995 grams, about half a knocked. Sweet. And in 2005, when this camera came out, it was $999 USD, or in today's dollars, 1,650 turbo sad bucks, or roughly 2,327 turbo sad bucks, but Canadian. What makes this camera special? Well, this camera had a few firsts. First of the firsts, this is the first fixed lens digital camera with a chunky sensor, APS-C sized. It's also the first camera to feature a large format sensor that also provides full-time live view. Ooh, look at that. Remember that this is in an era when the first DSLR with live view, the Fujifilm S3, which I reviewed some time ago, had live view, but that was more of a proof of concept rather than an actual useful feature. The R1's live view is front and center on this camera. You shoot through the lens via the sensor. And in a way, This camera really is kind of the granddaddy of the RX1 series. Operation and feel. Let's start first with the feel. The camera is a bridge camera, so by definition, it's meant to be something between a DSLR and a point and shoot. This really is kind of on the DSLR size. I mean, look at it. It is quite chunky. All right, I ran around to get my Rebel XT, and let's have a look at these side by side. As you can see, the R1 is actually considerably bigger. And if I had an equivalent focal length lens to go on the XT, I believe the XT would overall still come out a bit lighter. So what I'm saying is the R1 is honestly a bit of a chunky and heavy camera. But the result of that is that ergonomics on this camera are generally good. The grip is big, it's textured, and honestly the camera is just pretty nicely made. It legitimately feels better than the DSLR it's meant to compete with. Overall, the build quality is, as I said, solid. It is all plastic, but it feels like solid plastic. Now, being a bridge camera, this camera does have a properly mechanically coupled zoom ring. So that's nice, and again, it leans into the more DSLR-like controls. The ring is well dampened, and honestly, it's a solid zoom ring. Behind it, you get something that is less solid. It is the focus ring, and it is a fly-by-wire system. Nowadays, that's pretty common, but in 2005, this is a bit of a meh attempt at it. I personally just don't like using it. I don't really like them even on modern cameras, so maybe I'm just a bit biased. When it comes to operation, let's have a look at control layout. This is a bit of a mixed bag. It does a lot of things right, but it also does a lot of things kind of meh. This camera was meant to compete with the likes of the digital Rebel XT and other entry-level cameras from the likes of like Nikon. And it does a couple things actually better. For example, the R1 has a dual command dial layout. You can see on the back here, you have one there for your thumb, but also you have one here also for your thumb. It's kind of weird. But I will say the command dial for the one that is on the thumb perch here is quite nice. And it's just a bit odd that they didn't put another one in front of the shutter, but it generally works. Moving my thumb from one command dial to the other is all right. It's just a bit strange. Another pretty neat control is the fact that in this command dial, the center of it, you have a directional control, similar to the AF joystick. And I'm not sure if having this flanked by the command dial was like a great idea, but I personally think this is also another kind of meh thing. It kind of turns this whole control into a strange multifunction-ish controller. But I will say otherwise, the joystick is relatively responsive and it even clicks in. I did have some issues though using it, as I would sometimes hit the actual command dial bit while doing stuff with the joystick. So yeah, again, some good, some bad. But I'm guessing you may have noticed now that this camera seems to have an otherwise fairly haphazard button layout. And it really isn't that intuitive. Where Canon and Nikon were getting into their stride with the concept of their control schemes for their entry-level goods, and they generally set a general framework for how their cameras, their entry-level cameras, would control moving forward, Sony didn't quite set the standard with this camera. When you look at the back, there are bits that make sense. The menu button being accessible by the right thumb, pretty good. So you can easily jump into the menu, awesome. The ISO button that is just over here, right by your shutter, also great. Lets you quickly shift ISOs. And there's even auto ISOs, very auto. and it's not bad. But then you have something like this, the mode dial, that's just oddly, awkwardly in the back. Admittedly, with it being placed here, I never really knocked it around or anything. Not that that was really a problem on other cameras, but I'm just trying to rationalize why this is here. But yeah, it's just weird having to adjust to the mode dial being in this general location. Here's a little bit more oddness. I'm actually used to having a lot of shooting options in my right hand, and the R1 kind of mixes things up. The playback button is just to the left of your AF joystick up here, and I personally find it's kind of a button that kind of gets lost on me. Like, I literally sometimes can't find it. But maybe that's just because I haven't used this camera very long. But I also just find it is a little bit far away. Another thing that's a little uncomfortable is the magnify button. That's over here. That is legitimately a bit of a stretch for my thumbs. So I imagine for people with smaller hands, this might actually be uncomfortable. But there are other things in this camera that you'd expect are on here, and it's kind of nice to see. You got your metering mode, drive mode, self-timer, they're over here. And they flank generally the left side of the camera, so you can generally get to them pretty quickly with your left hand, or if you really stretch, your thumb. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but then you also have these toggles here, and honestly, I kind of appreciate that they're there, but I wouldn't mind if these were replaced with other buttons and just made into menu options. So you have framing and preview toggle here, and then you have the Finder automatic switch toggle. And again, something that could have been switched to another button or another purpose, and that could have been relegated to the menu. These are things I don't think normally people change that often. And by the way, if you don't know what framing mode is, it's when the camera maintains a good exposure in live view so you can better frame up your image instead of trying to preview what the exposure simulation is. And yeah, that was more of a thing in the older days. And come to think of it, you can still do the framing mode. I think sometimes they just have a different name nowadays. But no, I do sometimes also see it as framing mode, but less common today. Additionally, adapting to exposure changes takes the camera a second. And if you're trying to manual focus and you want to use a punch-in, the only amount of punch-in you get is 2 times, which is frankly not enough, especially on a panel that is only 230-ish K dots. The top LCD kind of gets points for its overall pretty cool implementation being hinged at the bottom, so you can actually flip it around, shoot it like a TLR, top-down style, but it's not the greatest display, and chances are if you do this outside, it's going to be blotted out by the sun. But it can be easily configured also for overhead shots, so pretty neat. Although it's not, you don't get the greatest angle. Lastly though, or normally though, when I shoot this, I just like to park it shut and use the EVF. Now, I get that this is a bit of an interesting layout, but I think honestly it's kind of one of the stars of this camera. You get this interesting implementation for a display. One of the more egregious things about this camera is that even though it has dual card slots, you can see you got your CF and memory stick slots. This, instead of being handled by camera software where you can set where your images are written, this is done via physical toggle. The weird thing is Sony kept doing this in their DSLR line for quite a while, and it's honestly pretty baffling. It's just weird, and I frankly don't like it. When it comes to using the displays, let's have a look at the menus. When you press the menu button, you get greeted with some quick menu items, and let's quickly go through those. You got basically your resolution, You have your picture profiles, a couple things. But go all the way to the right and you will be greeted with a proper menu. And this is where it's actually nice that you have a bit of an older camera because the menu itself is not very bloated. This is, after all, purely a stills-based camera. So the menu structure is fairly simple. You got camera, memory, card setup, and I think, sorry, camera, memory, card, and setup, not card setup. And you also have some sub-menu items. Now, this menu itself is fairly simple, and it could have been colorized, but it is simple enough that you really can't get lost in the system. Now, if you have a look at the button right here, this will let you toggle through your display screens that are on your EVF or rear display. And it's pretty nice, and you can go through a bunch of different modes that'll either leave you with very info-dense displays or a very clean display. It's up to you. Just a reminder that this was a camera made before we knew how to make EVFs not suck, generally. So, of course, this one kind of sucks. The refresh rate on it takes a nosedive when it gets a little bit dark. And it actually also becomes pretty noisy as well, hindering your ability to actually properly compose and frame, especially if you're trying to use the manual focus. And it's not helped by the fact that the number of pixels on display, even through the EVF, is quite low. I personally think that if they were able to maybe double that to around 400K dots, that this might be on the cusp of usable today, but as it is, it really, really shows its age. It is not good. And it's not really helped by that primary top panel. As cool as this is for letting you do a selfie, its even lower resolution and low brightness means that in daylight, this is difficult to use. Now, before we move on, there's one last set of buttons on this camera, and it's the side. You have your flash mode, white balance, and they're actually pretty well placed so you can easily get to them with your left thumb. And it's actually a pretty natural spot, and I think a reasonably good implementation. Even the other options on the side, the AF implementation on here, which is a switch, makes reasonable sense. You can pop it in and out of autofocus, macro mode, and manual focus. And with the manual focus, if you get tired of using the fly-by-wire, you can actually press the center button and the autofocus will kick in. So even they knew that manual focusing wasn't going to be that great. To sum up, though, overall, the R1 is well built. It has some odd ergonomic choices, and yeah, it's a interesting camera. Oh, one last thing though, before I forget. The actual eye sensor for the EVF works surprisingly well, which is very weird because the EVF on my A7 II detects a face when it's 4,000 feet away from the camera. And it seems that they got it right on this R1 so many years ago. Image quality and autofocus. The sensor and lens combo are actually quite nice. I overall found the zoom range it's fairly good. It covers a lot of the focal lengths that you'd normally want to have, and generally it does do what it sets out to do, be one camera to do it all, giving you focal lengths from reasonably wide to a short telly. And the f2.8 to 4.8 is a pretty reasonable aperture given the wide coverage of it. It's not going to be a background blur champion, but if you zoom in and compress your background, the R1 will give you pretty solid blurrage. The 10 megapixel sensor on this camera is also still very much reasonably capable of delivering nice shots. Obviously, noise performance here won't have aged well. It performs as you'd expect for a 20-year-old CMOS sensor. But that said, if you're shooting with older DSLRs anyways, this probably won't bother you, and we now have pretty modern noise reduction that help bring the shots back. Now let's go have a look at some noise samples. Looking at the samples, for me, I would shoot this camera between its base 160 and 800 ISO. But I'd try to keep things between 160 and 400 and use 800, knowing that I'll need to apply good noise reduction afterwards. Generally, I'd want to avoid 1600 plus. And here's the thing. On this camera, you can actually see that there is some noise even at the base ISO, and at 400, you'll get a notable amount of luminance and color noise. The color is easy enough to address with regular noise reduction, but luminance does end up eating into some detail, even at ISO 400. Luckily, I would say that from 400 to 800, the look of the luminance noise is actually not bad. It's sure destructive, but it doesn't look terrible, at least to me. When it comes to dynamic range, this is going to be about on par with, again, similar cameras of the era, like the Rebel XT. And this means there isn't a huge amount of room for recovery or for pushing. But when it's exposed right, you still get a good shot. Just, yeah, don't push or pull files super hard. When it comes to autofocus, this is where things start to really fall apart, especially if you're comparing it to older DSLRs, which had their phase detect systems that they could rely on for pretty good autofocus. And it was also generally pretty snappy on cameras like the Rebel XT, especially in the center point, where you're basically going to get rock solid AF performance. On the R1, because of its fairly rudimentary contrast detect system from all those years ago, it's only really good in good light, like sunny day kind of stuff. Indoor lighting is basically going to be a bit of a challenge with this. It will be leisurely at best, and it will be unhelpful at worst. But it does have an AF illuminator, so if you're okay turning it on, you'll be able to still get your shots. You'll just need to wait a while for it to get your focus confirmation. On top of that, the boxes for this camera for your focus are sometimes big, so it's a little bit vague on what the camera is actually focused on, so you might need to double check it when you're reviewing your images, or just trust the camera. When it comes to tracking, the camera really can't do it. The contrast detect AF is very rudimentary and it shows. Don't bother trying to do sports of any form with this thing unless you're just going to pre-focus anything. It's not like older DSLR systems where you can kind of predict how the system is going to react and generally trust the center point, as I said. This system had a hard time even switching between static objects in its tracking mode. Even as simple as leaning in and leaning out did not work well most of the times. This camera is for shooting stills of still things. In this regard, autofocus, DSLRs will have this camera generally beat. They'll be better at low light, and they can potentially track simple motion reasonably okay. And generally, I think that's fine and dandy anyway, since this camera cannot buffer continuous RAWs. However, there's one trick that this camera has over DSLRs of the past: the relatively silent shooting. Without an OVF and a flappy mirror to get in the way, and the fact that this thing has a leaf shutter, making it even quieter, you get basically near silent shooting, and as I said before, flash sync at all speeds. And you actually do get a hot shoe on this camera, it's just kind of in a weird spot. So it is an interesting, stealthy camera. But let's have a listen of the leaf shutter, maybe, if we can actually capture that sound. Okay, so I'm gonna try to get at least one shot on this thing. I'm gonna move the camera real close to the mic. Let's see if we got that. Recommendation and conclusion. Let's just cut to the chase. No, I don't really recommend this camera in 2025, at least not generally. Before we get to the price, I want to point out a couple things. Overall, this camera package has a very neat mark on photographic history. The camera is obviously the first big APS-C fixed lens camera, but overall, this camera to me lacks a bunch of things that make cameras fun and not just annoying. But it is an interesting curiosity from the past. The things that kind of really got me were things like the contrast detect AF being pretty hopeless in basically anything other than perfect light, the ergonomics that took one step forward and two steps to the side kind of threw me off a bit. But more than that, in the end, this camera is a fixed lens bridge camera. The fixed lens bit means that you really have to be dedicated to this camera to want to use it. Now, in 2025, it can still take great photos, in spite of the camera, not because of it. And if I had to sum it up, the camera overall, again, for me, generally isn't fun. It's fun to play with and fun to look back at, but I didn't have a massively fun time shooting it. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about price. This camera has a fairly wide going range for what they're selling for. It seems like basic functioning units can be had for as little as 100 USD, while whole camera kits with boxes and original accessories might fetch as much as 240 US dollar dues. As a whole camera package, it's actually pretty cheap. And when you consider that a fresh batch of new batteries can still be bought for these things, it might actually sound like a pretty good recommendation against entry-level DSLRs that it's meant to compete against. But let's remember, it is actually entirely possible to pick up a Rebel XT with a 50mm 1.8 for less than the cost of the R1. And the side benefit is that if you ever decide to switch and upgrade to newer cameras, you'll still have EF lenses that you can carry over, or adapt to new mirrorless systems if you're going that route. But you don't really get that option here, hence the fixed lens bridge camera-iness. So yeah, I assume that wasn't going to shock anyone, since most people know that this is not an interchangeable lens camera. But that's really what it comes down to. If you buy this camera, you're buying it really for this entire package, and probably not because you're planning to upgrade or whatnot. You're probably just planning to generally play with this as a curiosity. But here's another thing about this thing. This is a physically large camera. Even when you take into account lenses that you could have on other competing DSLRs at the time, this is physically fairly chunky. And it's even bigger when you compare it to even contemporary cameras, because my 5D4 with a 40mm pancake weighs less than this camera. Heck, if you pair the 40mm with even the older, chunkier 5DC, the R1 still weighs more than that. And honestly, the 5D Classic and a lens would sell for cheaper than a perfect box copy than the R1. So if you're looking for an ultra budget stills shooter, look at an older CMOS enabled DSLR from the same era that this camera was made in. They're literally now cheaper than dirt, and the lenses on them are still generally relevant. And if you're looking for some Sony history, then you're probably already set on an R1 one way or another. And that's really the only reason I'd think to buy one of these. Just to have it as a historical piece or a curiosity. But that's enough ranting from me. Do you have an R1? And if you do, what drew you to it? Would anyone want to shoot one of these today still? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye.